Hey guys, welcome back to the Tap and Go, where we talk all things rugby with people from all over the world. To mark the halfway point in this series, we've got something slightly different for you today. This is definitely one for all you die-hard rugby fans with interest in behind-the-scenes politics of the game, as we're joined by the CEO of World Rugby, Brett Gosper. Brett, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
It's a pleasure. I'm good, thank you very much.
For sure. So I guess with the whole corona situation going on, do you mind giving us a quick overview of what's changed in rugby due to the COVID situation and what's going to, just a quick overview of all of that?
Yeah, look, it's quite complex in the sense that we're looking at what's happening at rugby, obviously all over the world from a global perspective. Our main concern is the high loss of revenues for clubs in the key markets, but also the loss of international rugby, which funds the national governing bodies in each country and develops the sport and grows the sport and so on. So the interest is to get back playing as quickly as possible. Firstly, probably with just broadcast revenues, because crowds are limited. Unless you're in New Zealand, you'll have seen Super Rugby looks like nothing's ever happened in the world. They're getting 30 to 40,000 people to their games, and you're seeing some great games out there. And obviously that's generating some gate revenue as well as broadcast. But in most parts of the world, it looks like gate won't come back for a fair time. And it's a big part of revenues of some governing bodies, and in particular, the Rugby Football Union in England and so on. That's a big part of their revenues. But one step at a time, what we're looking to do, the Southern Hemisphere missed their July window inbound, which is revenue for the Southern Hemisphere unions. The Rugby Championship has obviously not happened either in the window that it was meant to happen in. So we're looking at a new, almost combined window around October, November, or late October into early parts of December, where we can make up some of that lost revenue with a condensed Rugby Championship in the South. And the North is looking to make up one or two games of the Six Nations, plus some other fixtures that may happen in October, November as well. So everyone's looking at that. In order for that to happen, there are some regulations that need to be changed. And a lot of conversations have been happening between ourselves and clubs to try and work out, what's an equitable way of sharing the pain, in fact, when we do come back into playing, because the players play for both the club and country, and therefore everyone wants them for their purpose of generating revenue, and those club players are mainly salaried by the club, so it needs to be managed in a correct way.
So you talk about that. So if you take, say, USA, for example, have recently had to declare bankruptcy in their rugby program. How is World Rugby trying to help those nations recover?
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say, so calendar's the first area that we're looking at to try and manage a, return to play. But the other aspect is obviously with the lack of revenue, all unions have taken, some extreme measures. Some have cut their workforce by 80%, cut their salaries by 40 to 50%. At World Rugby, we've cut our salaries between 20 and 30%, depending on where we are. That to provide more money. We've also borrowed against our reserves. We are fortunate enough to have completed a World Cup, which generates 80% of our revenue for World Rugby itself. And our next World Cup's in 3 years' time. So we actually were quite fortunate landing our revenue between just before the crisis and having a bit of time before the next revenues come in. And we manage those revenues over a 4-year period. What we've done is we've borrowed against those revenues, borrowed against our reserves, which sit at between 150 to 200 million pounds, and set up a kind of relief fund of 100 million pounds to help out unions where COVID has pushed them over the edge, created a lack of revenue because of the lack of inventory, sponsorship pressures, all of the rest of it. So yes, like the United States, we've stepped in and structured some financing and repayment programs over a longer period of time that allows people some relief. And we'll be doing that with the top strongest 10 financial unions. All of them will be seeking some form of advancement on payment like that, as well as 20 to 30 other unions requiring some help. So we've set ourselves up a little bit as a relief bank at the same time. And there's an independent group that assesses requirements and depoliticizes the the distribution of that relief.
Sure. So I guess taking a step back and moving on and looking at, I guess, tier 2 nations as a whole in international rugby at the moment, I guess we often see sort of players from these tier 2 nations, in particular sort of the Pacific Islands, moving to these tier 1 nations and playing for not their respective birth countries, but their new adopted countries. What are some ways, I guess, to sort of strengthen these tier 2 nations and sort of keep the players playing for their birth countries?
Yeah, look, it's important that, first of all, players come north usually from the Pacific Islands, and even more so now. You obviously get players coming from Australia, even New Zealand, Argentina, into the set, because the three highest paying leagues now in the world are in England, France, and Japan. And it's quite right that the players can ply their trade and earn money for playing rugby where they can. But what's important for us also is the strength is maintained on the international scene. So we've got a very strong World Cup that generates money to develop the game. That's the virtuous cycle that we hope to remain in. So it's important that Samoa, Fiji, Tonga retain talent for those international games, so they're qualifying those players. It's harder now. We've moved the residency rule from 3 years to 5 years, so it's much harder to capture those players on a short-term basis by northern unions. That was one move that happened in the last cycle from a governance point of view. So therefore, the capturing of those players would have to happen at a lot earlier age for it to be effective in terms of, sorry about this, my other phone going. And I think that was a strong move in favour of the unions. But at the end of the day, there will be opportunities either through education, future contracts and so on for younger players. They will head into places like England and New Zealand for the good of those players. And yes, they'll be able to choose whether they want to play, whether it be for the All Blacks, England, or their home nation. And these are often economic choices of well-being as well. So you can't completely avoid that opportunity for players or negate it. So it's a matter of ensuring that there's enough of a reservoir of those local players to provide the competition that's required.
Yeah, that's understandable. So obviously the Rugby World Cup happened this year, and on the whole, it was an unbelievable success. But one thing which got noted is that some teams turn up, and smaller teams turn up, and it's an honour from them to be there. They are sort of a spectator in the tournament. Is there a way, like they do in sevens, to have sort of a plate or a bowl competition, so like a tier 2, so a country like Georgia, Italy, so they continue playing throughout the tournament?
Yeah, the trouble is it's an incredibly complex tournament already, where you've got 48 games over a 6-week period. There are high costs involved with keeping those players in hotels and boarded over the time, and generally a bit like the Olympics, once their playing days are over, rather than leave groups of 30 odd players and officials hanging around for a good time and so on, it's actually best to get them on their way, get them back to their countries, their clubs and so on. It avoids any incidents, it cuts cost, and as I said, it's already highly complex, over 10 different centres. 48 games over 6 weeks is incredibly ambitious already. So if you're trying to run in parallel another mini competition and so on, it just the complexity is too much in fact. So we have looked at these things in the past, but it just doesn't seem to be workable from a logistics point of view. We debate often whether a Women's World Cup should accompany a Men's World Cup. And there are, two schools of thought on that. It's highly complex. The women should have their own day in the sun, not shaded by the men's game at the same time. Other people argue, well, actually having it at the same time with the men's game, you're using the men's game to draw attention to the women's game, and that can help in the short term as well. So, these are the debates that happen. But again, the complexity of putting both on at the same time is an issue or an element, and a cost factor for the host, because it costs, around £240 million to put on a World Cup in England, and almost twice that in Japan. So it's a very costly exercise, and you obviously need high revenues, which we do fortunately have to push through those costs and make some good surplus for the sport.
And Freddie just briefly mentioned, I guess, the takeaways that we had from the World Cup, and it was massively positive and so on. It redeveloped the game in Japan. And I guess you publicly stated that you wanted the USA to sort of bid for the 2027 World Cup. What does sort of what does a World Cup bring to sort of a nation like Japan or the USA in the current world?
Yeah, look, it's again, there's always been a desire by rugby, whether it be the club games, the unions, so on. Everyone knows that the biggest sports market is the United States. Rugby's incredibly reliant and has been up until the Japan World Cup on two broadcast markets. Broadcast is 60% of the revenue of a World Cup, followed by sponsorship, hospitality, ticketing, which goes to the local union, is obviously very important as well in helping to pay the costs that a local organiser has to pay to put the sport on. But for World Rugby, it comes from broadcast and sponsorship and hospitality in particular. As I said, the ticketing goes to the host union. We are, as a sport, England and France are probably, as I say, 60% of the broadcast market versus the rest of the world in terms of revenues. Therefore, Japan was chosen, A, to develop the sport in Asia as a participation sport, but also to develop a broadcast market. It's obviously the third biggest industrial country in the world. It is, or the third biggest economy, and a very big broadcast market. And at this Rugby World Cup, it was the number 3 broadcast score, which in terms of revenues, it went from earning us about $2.5 million in England to about 30 to 40 million in Japan. So if we can sustain that, we've got a third broadcast market for World Cup now, which sits pretty much comparably alongside England and France for a broadcast contract. They sit a bit higher than that, but it's in the ballpark. The United States is the other big broadcast market that we'd love to tap. And our belief is either the US team has to get into a semi-final at least, or win a World Cup to really engender the interest of the nation. But what can really accelerate that, as it did for FIFA, was actually them hosting World Cup in their own market. Now, that has to be voted by council. That has to be bid against other countries that would feel that they definitely want to host a World Cup too. So it's not something we can orchestrate. It's something we can encourage and something that we can hope for. And what we know is if the US become a host of a World Cup, there'll be a lot of effort in developing their team to do well, as we helped Japan develop their side to be competitive from England. Actually, prior to the England World Cup in 2015, they did so brilliantly, beating South Africa. Should have gone into the semi-finals, really. They were the first side to win the number of games that they did not go into a quarter-final on points. But then they made up for that in Japan and so on. But that was a program over about 10 years to develop that side, because what we know is you can develop a broadcast market when, as Japan showed, the national team does well. And if you did that in America, you could eventually have broadcast revenues higher than England or France or Japan and so on. So, and that's not just important for the USA, because the money we generate from a World Cup gets distributed around 160 countries of the world to develop the sport over the next 4 years. So while it looks like it's a favouring USA policy, it's a return on investment policy to get money back into the game elsewhere in the world as well.
Definitely. So I guess sort of the recent news with World Rugby is that the re-election of Sir Bill Beaumont over the Argentinian Pico. I guess for our general sort of listeners and sort of our more, what's Sir Bill sort of hoping to bring to World Rugby and sort of change? Yeah,
look, I think there are a number of, his manifesto was actually not, I don't think, that different to Gus Pichot's program. They're looking at modernising the governance, making us more agile in our decision-making, professionalising that governance, obviously increasing the strides that have been made in player welfare, putting players more central to the decision-making, involving them a lot more in our governance, developing some new markets for broadcast, as I said, on Rugby World Cup, enhancing the value of Rugby World Cup and sevens and our Olympic involvement. So I think, generally speaking, their programs were reasonably similar. And maybe there was a style difference, and that's why the council voted the way they did. But look, it was a close contest. And as I said, what was interesting was they're both pretty much pushing a pretty similar program of reform and modernisation, and growing the game and involving all stakeholders in the development of the game and so on. So, Bill had done 4 years. This is his second 4-year term. Gus is young enough to have another crack at it at some point in the future.
Yeah. So at the moment, there are a lot of players who are moving clubs. So a lot of people flocking to Japan after having seen how competitive they were at the World Cup. And we're wondering, is it time to sort of introduce like a transfer market to rugby rather than just having most players either coming through their academy?
Sorry, to introduce, I didn't hear that.
A transfer market to rugby instead of having just most of their players coming through an academy.
Yeah, they talk about that, and maybe that is something that might develop out of from football and so on. I mean, that's the area of player transfer, clubs, and so on. A lot of unions feel that when clubs take players out of their union, that they should be compensated for the value of those players because they've trained them through to a point and so on. That debate goes on, but that's very much for the club rugby scene to be determining whether there's a transfer market, how that would operate. And we're, as we said before, a bit more concerned about player movement in terms of their availability for international games. So that may well be a market phenomena that happens in future. But what's important for us is that those players are still available to play international rugby wherever they apply their trade for their clubs.
Is there a sort of current...
That's part of our regulation, which is called Regulation 9, which is so important to releasing, and all of, FIFA have the same issues. They need their players released from club games so that they can play international games as well.
Is there a current league or sort of a system in sport that World Rugby sort of maybe not aspiring, but try and see sort of the light in and sort of be similar to?
No, not really. Maybe some of the club leagues are aspiring to be like the Premier League and so on. It's quite a different setup. There is a primacy of the international game in rugby, which is quite unique to many sports. There aren't many sports that have such a strong international backbone versus the club backbone. And probably from a broadcast audience point of view, an international game is worth about 15 to 20 times a club game in broadcast revenue and so on. And we like that situation because the international game doesn't just increase players' salaries, it actually provides development money to structure the sport, to grow the sport, women's sport, teams, participation, communities, and only governing bodies do that. Clubs tend to, yes, they do contribute to the community, and the club setup does, of course, contribute to the community, but a lot of increases in revenue tend to find their way into increased player salaries, which is not a bad thing if you can afford it. But the federations and the governing bodies are the ones that invest in the growth, the grassroots of the game, and that's important.
Yeah, that obviously makes sense. Moving on, so do you think in the future that there will ever be an opportunity to sort of merge the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere into one big global rugby calendar? Because obviously that's something that has been talked about to try and...
Yeah, look, we tried. It depends on what you mean by one rugby calendar. You've got to look at these things through the eyes of the fan. And what's important is that there is meaningful competition and that it rolls into a narrative that the fans appreciate. Because at the end of the day, if you haven't got your fans, you haven't got the revenues, players won't have salaries, the sport won't grow. And so it's about creating a narrative for the fan that makes it more compelling and interesting, that they're willing to pay money to watch, that more people are willing to come in and watch and so on. So we attempted to do that through the Nations Championship, which didn't get off the ground for a number of reasons. But, we actually had a back for about £6.2 billion. We were using the current footprint of the Northern Southern windows. We were using the Six Nations and the Rugby Championship as the basis to which you'd move forward on points. That each team in the competition would play each other once through the year, and there'd be a final at the end of it. And so each, maybe 2 years of 4, you'd have this world championship, so to speak, World Nations Championship. At the time, the Six Nations, there were 2 barriers to that. Six Nations were against a relegation promotion system because they're a commercial entity protecting their 6 members. And they felt that was a threatening element, that they would find themselves out of the Six Nations. And at the same time, they were also talking to some private equity money and wanted a cash injection immediately rather over time, which is what we were proposing. So it fell down. Now, in the meantime, there have been lots of conversations, and I think there is a movement towards a more coherent competition of a championship of a kind that will happen maybe 2 years in the 4, that's similar to that Nations Championship, but that overcomes some of the obstacles that we found when we were leading that process. And we're part of the process in finding a new competition. But again, it's about creating a competition, and what might make it better is having October and November, moving July to October, having those 2 windows over a period of 8 weeks, so there's a more focused narrative for fans and so on. Or not. You could still do what we were doing, which is have the Six Nations, have the nations, and then have them come together in November in some form of playoff that gives you a world champion in 2 of the years. At the moment, the November window, the problem is it's just fixtures. They're great fixtures, and there's no such thing as an unmeaningful test match, but it's more meaningful if it's part of a roll-up of a competition and that someone can win a competition at the outset. And that's what you're trying to solve. Both July and November have no competition meaning, and therefore it doesn't come at a higher interest level for fans, and that's what they're looking to solve at the moment.
Do you think there's ever a window, say, on the club scale, to have sort of the winner of the Heineken Cup plays the winner of the Super Rugby?
Well, that's another thing that's being looked at. I think it's being looked at both by World Rugby and by the clubs. Is there the possibility, and again, it might be once every 4 years, is a Club Rugby World Cup. And a Club Rugby World Cup would, benefit from the IP of the Rugby World Cup brand, or is it just a simple championship playoff by the top 4 or 8 teams around the world that happens also each point? That's being looked at. That will happen at some point. It'll be in the club part of the calendar, and something will have to give every 4 years to make that happen. It might be a truncated version of one of the existing competitions, but somewhere room will need to be found in the club area of the calendar. Trouble is, we haven't got enough weeks to do everything the clubs and the internationals would want to do to earn money. And at the same time, you've got to be careful, because more games don't mean more money. You want the specialness of international rugby to be retained. You don't want it to be saturated, and you also don't want to saturate the players, because those key players can be worn out very quickly if they're not managed in terms of their own player welfare and the frequency and intensity of the games that they're playing.
So I guess on that topic of clubs in Super Rugby, at the moment we see sort of the All Blacks of perhaps going their own way. We see South Africa perhaps getting almost pushed out, and Australia sort of in this limbo state where they don't know if they want to join the All Blacks or sort of become independent, and never mind sort of Japan and Argentina. Where do you see, I guess, with all the 5 nations, where do you see Super Rugby, well, I guess the nations within Super Rugby go in terms of club?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. And also, you have to separate Super Rugby, which is, again, a commercial operation, which has underpinned the Rugby Championship, in fact. And does a change in Super Rugby participants necessarily mean a change in the Rugby Championship itself? And it may not necessarily. The Rugby Championship could well retain the 4 teams that are there. And we're seeing all sorts of things in the media, and I know no more than you on that front than what is reported, that New Zealanders want a certain number of teams in a trans-Tasman set up with Australia. South Africa seem to be on the out. They've got some teams that have come into the Pro 14. Is that the direction of travel? Are they going to go more domestic? Are they going to debase somewhere else in the Southern Hemisphere a team that might be in the Super Rugby? No one knows. They're looking at all of these different versions. But I do think the Rugby Championship of those 4 teams, remember, Argentina only just recently came into Super Rugby. They were in the Rugby Championship and all their players were playing in France. And so I think the Rugby Championship is a highly valuable tournament, particularly if in the future it underpins and rolls up into an annualised rugby championship as well. That's on a more global scale. So I think we've got to sit and watch and wait and see what the Super Rugby nations decide for Super Rugby. But it does seem there's some rapprochement between New Zealand and Australia to find a solution themselves, and Argentina and South Africa don't seem to be in some of the plans that you're seeing in the media. But again, I'm reading it like you are on that, and hearing maybe a few more rumours than you are, but I don't want to go into those.
Understandable. So one thing which has been confirmed and announced that the All Blacks are going to be playing the Australian Rugby League side towards the end of the year.
Has that been confirmed? I've seen different articles that it's been confirmed and not confirmed, and I'm not sure that has been confirmed.
Yeah, I think the date's been penciled in, but so I guess whatever that means.
Yeah, look, that's an interesting. What that shows is everyone is desperate for revenue at the moment, and that would probably be a curiosity for broadcast and for fans. I think these kind of mixed code games, and we've seen them in Aussie rules with Gaelic football. We've seen it in the past, actually, even in England at the time that rugby went professional between rugby league, which was professional, and rugby union in the 90s. I always think they sound a lot better than they actually turn out to be. It's a bit like we used to have mixed martial arts with Muhammad Ali as well. And they were big purse winners and big money spinners. And look, again, the game, we're often not as innovative as we should be, and maybe that's something we should be looking into. But in that part of the world, that will create huge interest, because rugby league is a very big sport in Australia in particular. And the All Blacks, obviously, iconic status, and anyone they play will garner interest. So
but you don't think there's on the sort of looking at the longer term, there's not a market for it to develop into anything?
Well, I don't really see the purpose or the point of it. No, not particularly. I mean, rugby league is a cousin sport. There are a lot of similarities, but obviously it grew out of rugby union. And I grew up in Australia and grew up partly in Sydney, and know the strengths of rugby league. But it's a relatively small game on the international sphere. It is played in Northern England, Sydney and Brisbane. There's a team in New Zealand called the Warriors. There's a team in France. It's relatively restricted. So, it's about getting rugby union rights, not about games like that, I think. But if it brings rugby league fans into the rugby union franchise, maybe that's a good thing.
Sure.
Yeah. So one thing which has come out in the last couple of days is the fact that World Rugby are considering to reduce the amount of substitutes. I know coaches such as Eddie Jones sees that less substitutes would be a better idea. What can you sort of just go slightly further into this?
Yeah, that's a debate. The general debate, and we have a rugby committee which is forming into a specialist group in the future of people who really are there to shape the game. And leading coaches such as Eddie Jones will be on that group, and he'll have his chance to give his view, as will all of the leading game shapers, let's call them. And his view is very much that fatigue, I think, is something which will help open the game up. And with all the replacements coming on and so on, you don't get that fatigue. And therefore the game's not opening up and providing the continuity it should. And let's, stop those delayed areas of the game, whether it be scrum resets, TMOs, etc., and all the rest. And of course, we're for all of that. All of these things need an evidence-based approach, though, to measure what the implications are on player welfare. It's all very well to say you want players to be fatigued, but that may create a spike in injuries. And there's another theory that says actually fresh players coming on and playing against unfresh players will cause spike in injuries. And we're doing a lot of work around this so that any decisions we make in these areas lead with a player welfare point of view. But all of these things always need to be trialed at some point in an elite competition to see what the outcomes are. So I definitely think the reduction of reserves replacements has been talked about for a while. So there could well be a trial in that area and a trial in other areas to accelerate or eliminate, let's say, some of these dead periods in the game and keep the continuity going. But with continuity often comes higher velocity, higher injury rates, and so on. So all of these things have to be managed. When you change something over here in rugby, something else over here, some unintended consequences come of that. And that's why they need to be thoroughly trialled and analysed on an evidence-based player welfare approach.
I just want to ask one more question on that topic of, I guess, of opening the game up and a bit more fluidity. What sort of, I guess, World Rugby, or perhaps your impression on the current sort of 50-22 rules in Super Rugby, or like the goal line dropouts that they've introduced?
Yeah, they're all part of the trials that we pushed. We had what normally happens at the end of a 4-year cycle. A trial, a law process is a 4-year cycle, which is very, very slow in many ways. We can bring in laws for player welfare. The executive committee can vote on the hoof, but generally speaking, there's a cycle where after a World Cup, unions provide probably about 100 ideas that get discussed in a law review group, which is representative across the world, gets narrowed down to probably about 15. They get trialled in certain competitions. Then it becomes a northern trial, southern trial, global trial. And in the year of a World Cup, no trials, because you want everyone operating under the laws of the game that will be under a World Cup. So, it's, now I've gone down a rabbit hole there. What was the original question?
Does World Rugby see the current sort of changes with the 50?
Yeah, so those changes. So what I was going to say, so that's the normal law trial process. But we had our first player welfare-led law session about 1.5 years ago. There was a series of tragic deaths in the French game. We'd never seen a spike such as that in any country. And there was a series in France that led us to do a forum of law change that was entirely, the objective was to reduce the injury rate rather than make the law, test it to ensure that it doesn't spike injuries. This was, let's design some laws that will actually reduce injury rates and so on. And actually the 50-20 or the 50-22 or whichever way you want to call it was one of those such laws. And there are trials happening in France at only tackling waist height. There's a whole series of trials happening in different competitions that are addressing the how to reduce injury rates. And the 50-20 law is one of those because it obviously requires you to put your wingers back on the touch. It opens some spaces. There's a few less collisions and so on. It's more about evasion than running through. And so, these are small modifications that we're hoping, and that's in trial in the Super Rugby. And at the end of the Super Rugby season, we'll have all the stats that show what did it do to concussion rates, what did it do to collision rates, breakdowns, etc. So each of these are analysed absolutely thoroughly to work out what effect they had on the game. And they'll have some effect that we didn't intend somewhere else that may be positive or negative as well.
Yeah.
That's one example of that.
Yeah. Well, I personally loved it. But Brett, I just wanted to say...
great. I think it's, seen some... I saw on the weekend there's some really good kicking in that way that you could see the wingers having to drop back. And it makes it more interesting. Now, it was a rugby league idea, and there's some ideas that will steal from rugby league, as I'm sure they steal a few of ours. But that's a good one to open the game up.
Sure. Well, Brett, I just want to say, thank you very much for coming on our podcast. It was fascinating to hear, I guess, all about sort of what's going on underneath rugby and sort of supporting rugby as a sport that we all love, and sort of what's going to happen in the future. So thank you.
That was my pleasure.
Very much.
My pleasure. And hopefully all the regulatory stuff and the when you're talking about it on a world view, it may not be quite as interesting as we're talking about individual clubs and so on, but hopefully it's been of interest to your audience in some way.
No, definitely.
Really enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Good luck, guys.
Come on!